Right, so this is going to be the first in our series of lessons on parliamentary reforms between 1780 and 1885. I'm probably going to have to break this up into several different videos because it's quite long. I believe today we're going to go over some of the early attempts for reform, the Disenfranchising Act of 1793, some events in the 1820s, a couple of reform acts in the 1820s, such as the Taxing Corporations Act and the obviously Catholic Emancipation Act, and we'll get on to the Great Reform Act and probably the 1867 Representation of the People's Act next lesson, and then we'll do a third lesson where we'll cover the rest of the period. So I'll put them into a playlist together. So let's get into it. Attempts to introduce reform before 1832. In 1780, the MP John Dunning started a miniature reform movement when he remarked, "The power of the Crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished," as a response to demands for economic reform from opponents to the government whom disliked the government's handling of the American War of Independence that took place between 1776 and 1783. But parliamentary reform was far different to economic reform, so nothing came of Dunning's movement. William Pitt the Younger then proposed to reform Parliament in 1785, stating that the people were loud for equal representation. Pitt proposed to disenfranchise 36 of the worst rotten boroughs and redistribute their 72 seats to London and more highly populated counties. Pitt's bill failed to pass the Commons because many MPs saw it as an attack on property rights, and the King was opposed to the bill. Following the end of the American War in 1783, taxes and government expenditure were cut, so demand for parliamentary reform declined. So, the repeal of the 1728 Disenfranchising Act in 1793. The Disenfranchising Act was one of a series of penal laws which discriminated against Roman Catholics and other nonconformist groups. The Disenfranchising Act prohibited all Roman Catholics from voting in parliamentary elections, and it was passed following the death of George I in 1728. The Act was repealed in 1793, allowing the franchise in Ireland to all men holding a property with a rental value of at least £2 annually. The historian James Kelly argues that the Act was repealed as a matter of political principle by liberal Whigs who wanted to extend the franchise to Catholics. Therefore, this reform was driven by political principles held by MPs, and not political expediency or extra parliamentary pressure. So, now we're going to move on to more attempts to introduce reform before 1832, when Earl Grey attempted to introduce a reform bill in the years 1793 and 1797. At which time he was the MP for Northumberland, but those bills for parliamentary reform were defeated. Demand for parliamentary reform grew following the French Revolution in 1789, but nothing came of it, and demand for reform subsided during the wars against the French from 1793 to 1803, and the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815, due to the popular loyalist movement, as well as government repression of English radicals, through events such as Pitt's Reign of Terror, or later on in the 1800s, Lord Liverpool's Six Acts. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, demand for reform grew and the working class demanded manhood suffrage. The middle class did not support the radical campaign for reform, but some did support moderate reform, such as redistribution of the seats to industrial areas so they could have their interests represented in Parliament. This period, following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, was a turbulent time, with a plethora of extra-parliamentary protests taking place, which failed to bring about any kind of reform. The economy recovered in the 1820s, which caused demands for reform to subside, but not entirely. So, it goes quiet for a while, and then in 1821 the government disenfranchises Grampound, which was a rotten borough, and gave the seat to Yorkshire, a growing industrial town. So in 1821 the government disenfranchised the corrupt Cornish borough of Grampound, which had a very small population, and gave the seat to Yorkshire. The newfound economic stability in Britain caused the middle class to view parliamentary reform as a more respectable cause at this time, but further reform in the 1820s seemed unlikely, as the Tories dominated the government and King George IV was against reform. So, the repeal of the Tax and Corporations Act in 1828. The repeal of the Tax and Corporations Act in 1828 allowed nonconformists to sit on town councils, thus making Catholic emancipation more likely. The Tax Act mandated those seeking to hold civil or military office to take a sacrament to the rites of the Church of England, and the Corporations Act mandated a sacrament for those seeking to become members of town corporations. The acts were repealed as a result of a campaign by various religious groups, such as the Unitarians, the Wesleyan Methodists, the Primitive Methodists, and the Society of Friends. This means that the repeal of these acts can be denoted to extra-parliamentary pressure. The repeal of the acts alleviated the discrimination against nonconformists. However, Roman Catholics were still prevented from holding public office until the passing of the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829. So, now let's actually have a look at the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. Arthur Wellesley passed the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829 as a means to appease Daniel O'Connell and his Catholic Association in Ireland, whom had led a vigorous campaign for Catholic emancipation in Ireland and threatened insurrection in the event that their demands were not met. Wellesley therefore passed the Act as a means to prevent an insurrection in Ireland led by Daniel O'Connell. Ergo, the Act was a result of extra-parliamentary pressure. The Act essentially repealed the remaining penal laws which discriminated against Catholics, and it admitted Irish and English Roman Catholics to Parliament, and all but a handful of public offices. This meant that now Daniel O'Connell could claim his seat that he had won in 1828, as he was no longer prohibited from becoming an MP. So that's it for this short period. Next lesson, the Great Reform Act, and likely the 1867 Act as well, with whatever goes on in between. So that's it for this lesson. Thank you.